The criminal landscape in London during the early 1800s was beginning to change. As the Industrial Revolution was forging ahead with enough steam power to change the world forever, those who were beginning to fall by the wayside were the most vulnerable in society. Crime was growing, daily riots were breaking out, and the chances of being robbed on the street were more likely than not. London was becoming a lawless city, ungovernable and unruly, and if things didn't change, and fast, everything was going to fall apart, and the city would be left in smouldering ruins. The Bow Street Runners had done a successful job of keeping Covent Garden safe, and the Fielding brothers, who established the force, John and Henry, had left a legacy of strong origins. But ultimately, the money was drying up, and without significant investment in this new changing societal landscape, things were doomed. But outside of London, one man had been experimenting with a new kind of police force, but would this scheme, which was unpopular with the locals, work on a much grander scale? And would those affected go quietly, or would they put up a fight? Today on Macabre London, we uncover the story of Robert Peel and his Bobbies, as we take a look behind exactly what it takes to establish the Metropolitan Police Force. Welcome back to the next episode of my Crime and Punishment in London series. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and in the last episode we touched on the establishment of the Bow Street Runners, the first police force of its kind. We explored the trials and tribulations of how magistrates exploited their charges and how the new fielding system threatened their corruption, which meant the new scheme wasn't popular with the big guy, but the little man won out. We learned how the societal pressures which engulfed the working classes, mainly poverty and alcoholism, turned them into an easy way to make money via extortion from gangs and magistrates, and how the whole system was entirely corrupt. The Fielding brothers worked to eradicate the systems which led people to a life of crime, and whilst this wasn't an overnight process, they made a good job of it and started to clean up the streets. But there was still quite a way to go. Now, if you're new here and this is your first time listening or watching Macabre London, then make sure you pick up with the first few episodes in this Crime and Punishment series so you're up to speed. But if you've been here for the duration, then let's dive straight back in. But if you want to get more of the show, I'd love for you to join me and the rest of the Ghoul Gang on patreon.com/Macabre London. It really is the best way to support the show and to keep it going in return for extra bonus content. But if that's not for you right now, no bother, just a big thank you for listening, spreading the word and being there. That's the most important thing. But now it's time to dust off your comfiest walking boots because we're about to go back out on the beat and pick up with the next part of Crime and Punishment in the capital city. At the turn of the century, London had settled into an egregious war with its residents, particularly those on the breadline. As crime had expanded, so did the list of offences you could be executed for. In a bid to try and use public executions as a deterrent, the most minor of crimes could land you a date with the executioner. By the 1800s, the list had expanded to encompass as many as 200 crimes, ranging from the incredibly petty forgery, theft of livestock, or damaging an orchard, to major crimes such as treason, arson, and murder. This increase in the amount of crimes that people could be hanged for was meant to work as a deterrent, but in fact the opposite happened. If there was no differentiation between petty and major crimes, you were damned if you did, and damned if you didn't. If you were going to pickpocket and be hanged, you may as well go all in and stage an armed robbery. It levelled the playing field and made all crimes equal. It also meant that juries didn't uphold their judicial responsibilities, as those who were faced with a murder case would obviously opt for the death penalty. But if they then had a child before them who had been charged with stealing a loaf of bread, chances were they were going to find them not guilty. This allowed criminals to get off scot-free with no punishment at all for smaller crimes, and whilst that was good for the person being accused, it meant there were no repercussions for something deemed less significant. As the list of crimes added to the bloody code grew and grew, it was obvious that something had to be done, as the current system wasn't working to deter criminals, and it was creating a huge class divide between the rich and the poor, the have and have-nots. The working classes were becoming suspicious of the rich, and if the factory owners wanted people to work for them rather than making a quick living on the streets, they'd have to create a more appealing prospect, which didn't result in people being killed for destroying a fish pond. One very popular option was deportation. Between 1787 and 1868, over 160,000 people were transported from England to America and Australia. These transportation sentences could range from just a few years' service to a whole life sentence. This was a hugely disruptive option for reform, but better than a death sentence. But nonetheless, more people who were shipped off, potentially never to be seen again by their families and friends, this did feel like it was a fate worse than death. In order to assess the situation for prisoners and the families of the executed, prison reformers began observing what life was like behind bars. In prisons on home turf, the word was starting to spread that the conditions were awful and cyclical. One relentless campaigner against the abhorrent prison conditions was Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker woman who was taken to Newgate Jail one day as part of her spiritual mission. She saw firsthand just how rough the situation was in prison, particularly for women and children. The mixed cells had everyone thrown in together, men, women and children, and many people were in there just a result of not being able to afford the fees to be given a trial, making them guilty with no get-out clause available. Prisoners slept on the cold, hard floor, sometimes with the luxury of a bit of straw thrown down, but sometimes this was covered in bodily fluids if a bucket wasn't provided. Elizabeth's main concern was the harsh treatment women and children faced in prison, and in 1818 she was the first ever woman to give evidence to a select committee in the Houses of Parliament based on her own witness account. Before this, Elizabeth had been working with female prisoners and their incarcerated children, who were thrown in with them, to get them female prison officers. This change made a world of difference to these women, who could lean on their shared experience in life, and which created a far kinder environment for their children. As Elizabeth's campaigning work for prison reform was gaining support, she was able to find herself picking up a few sympathetic politicians along the way who saw her insider knowledge as invaluable in creating a better way for the justice system. Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, was one of these people, and he trusted Elizabeth's judgment as to what should be tackled first to try and make life a little better for those behind bars. Elizabeth set up schools within prison to make sure the children of the prisoners didn't go without an education, as if they did, they were doomed to repeat the actions of their so-called criminal parents. The schooling was democratic, and prisoners were encouraged to give their opinions and thoughts, which grew their confidence. And alongside their children, women were encouraged to take part in their own learning, with knitting and needlework added to the roster of lessons. And reading and writing was also taught, so if and when they left prison, they had skills to fall back on, which made them more likely to gain ongoing employment. Elizabeth was a great proponent of making sure people left prison having been changed, whether that be religiously or by gaining skills, and in an ideal world, both. Robert Peel watched Elizabeth's tireless work from afar, and she used her systems of reforming prisoners in his proposal for the Jails Act of 1823. This act was proposed to try and change the many wrongdoings inside the many prisons up and down the country, but given that there was no system implemented to enforce the act or checks done to make sure the prisons were obeying the orders, it largely left things unchanged. By 1835, Elizabeth was once more back at the Houses of Parliament to give evidence that the 1823 Act had done little to improve conditions, and without anyone to enforce the changes, jails were still operating as isolated units with no governance. With her advice, prison auditors were created and dispatched across the country to help implement the guidance issued, or face hefty fines, or even risk closure if they didn't adhere, which worked. But all of this reform work was dealing with the criminals which had been caught, but there was still plenty to be done with those that were left roaming the streets. In 1826, Robert Peel, who was the Home Secretary at that time, was in charge of looking after the country's law and order. As the Bloody Code had made all crimes far too similar, he campaigned and eventually managed to reduce the number of hangable offences from over 200 to just 5. Treason, violent piracy, arson in royal dockyards, espionage, and the biggie, murder. He noticed that in big cities, and in particular London, that there was a huge divide in the safety of areas deemed to be rich living and those who were economically challenged. In the poor areas, there was very little in terms of provisions for policing, and so the watchmen were few and far between, corrupt or worse, non-existent. This allowed for crime to run rampant in areas where the hue and cry failed. In the richer areas, which could afford more watchmen, the crime rate was much lower, and so it seemed obvious to Peel that in order to make things safer for everyone, there must be a centralised police force which would look after all the residents, provided by the government. They would not be economically controlled, and thus the metaphorical rising tide would float all ships. London was no stranger to having an organised crime watch. The Thames River Police had been going since 1798. But as they'd been confined to the boundaries of the river and dealt with strictly port-related activities, the public didn't see them as a threat to their civil liberties. Robert was well aware that bringing in a police force could cause major problems, as he'd already had a go elsewhere with mixed results. In Ireland, he'd used the blueprint of another failed police bill from London, which didn't get passed in 1780. He tried to implement the Irish Constabulary Act of 1822, in which each Irish province would have a police force. Now, whilst it did have some initial success, it was a difficult and bloody battle, which erupted between officers and people living in rural areas, who saw this new group as a gang who were encroaching on their freedoms. Many violent fights broke out within Ireland, but the force kept growing as the English government and the Dublin Castle authorities poured more money into it, but there were a few things causing it to fail. The officers signing up were often not of the best calibre, and may well have just been looking to join so they had a legal reason to start fights, and with a low wage and harsh conditions, the job was not attracting the people which would be the best at it. Even though the force grew to over 8,000 officers by the 1840s, there was still a way to go to make it better. But as Robert was no longer in charge of the social matters in Ireland, he left those issues he created for someone else to tidy up and focused his efforts on London. With a few important lessons learned, Robert used his knowledge of jail reform to help shape the way the police would operate. He knew that the Bow Street runners had worked well, but they were woefully understaffed and not paid enough. So if this new system of the Metropolitan Police was going to work, there had to be some infrastructure built in from the beginning. And if Robert wanted some skilled detectives, then he definitely could have trained them using today's sponsor, Wolf Escape Games. And stay listening because I'm super excited to tell you about them because their games are so fun. If, like me, you'd rather spend your Saturday night chasing ghosts than spending hours trying to find something to watch on TV, then I've got something brand new for you, which is equal parts fun, intriguing, a little bit spooky, and gets the old brain box ticking instead of doom scrolling. Wolf Escape Games creates immersive, cinematic online escape room adventures that you can play with your partner, your mates, or even solo, if you're brave enough. I played one of their games, Hallows Hill, with my other half recently, and I absolutely loved it. The story unfolds in a haunted house with a tragic past, and as you solve the puzzles, the mystery begins to unfold in a way that's genuinely eerie and surprisingly emotional, so much so that I had to take a break halfway through playing it because it was tense. This particular game is atmospheric, clever, and just the right amount of creepy. Honestly, we got so invested and involved, and there were definitely a few surprising turns we didn't expect to take, and only a couple of minor squabbles over who was right. If you love things which are on the darker side, solving cryptic clues, and that rush you get when everything finally clicks together, these escape games are for you. And it's not just ghosts, you can also turn up the heat in Miami Bay, set in 1980s Florida, where you'll go undercover, fly planes, and play high-stakes poker to crack the case. Or if you're feeling a little more Victorian, you can join Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in Phantom's Hour to solve a case so strange you'll wonder if it's the work of something otherworldly. Also, these games are so reasonably priced for the entertainment they give you. You can complete it in one evening or play it over a few sessions, so you don't need to rush through it. All you need is Wi-Fi, a bit of brain power, and someone to share the excitement with. Or not, if you're the solo sleuth type. So if you're ready to swap mindless scrolling for something smart, eerie, and actually fun for an evening like no other, then head to wolfescapegames.com and use the code Macabre30 for a fantastic 30% off their games. They really do make a fabulous gift for that person who you don't know what to get. They also do bundle deals too, so if you fancy the look of a few titles, you can get that. That's wolfescapegames.com, link in the show notes. And let me know what you think when you've played one. You're going to have a blast. So with Robert Peel having had a trial in Ireland, he was now armed with a list of things his new force should have. Much like the Bow Street Runners, these would have to be upstanding men who didn't have a criminal past. They would need to be willing to use force when necessary, but not people who just loved a good old scrap. They would need to be physically fit, able to walk their beat, which would measure a whopping 10 miles a day, and they were to be 5'7" and up, around average height for a man at the time, and so that way Robert felt confident the men would be an equal match for anyone they had to arrest on the street. After some convincing in Parliament, Robert managed to push through his new Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. This government-backed initiative would organise a centralised force which would look after London, and eventually this would be rolled out across the whole country. Peel decided that London, in order to be policed effectively, would have to be split into districts. 17 districts were founded, which were no bigger than 10 miles in size. This meant that the assigned officers could walk their complete beat over the course of a day. Now, this was a serious operation. Previously, there had been far too few officers to make any impact on the street, and the Bow Street Runners had to carry out more detective work than a day-to-day keeping of the peace. This new outfit would have 144 standard constables and 4 inspectors per district. The idea being that detective work could still be carried out by officers for hire, like the Bow Street Runners. Much like the reform inside the capital's jails, Robert's emphasis was on prevention rather than punishment, and so he made sure that the new police were to be visible, which would hopefully cause a deterrent. However, this ominous presence was seen by the general public as a threat. They didn't like being watched over, and saw this as a rejection by the government of their civil liberties. After all, people were wary of the old-fashioned justice system in which they'd been profited from, being thrown in prison, forced to pay fines for crimes they hadn't committed, and it seemed this was just more trouble than it was worth for the working class. Plus, they didn't want their taxes going towards a force which would no doubt prey upon them to make money. There were also fears around what powers this new force would have. At the Peterloo massacre, when the military had been called in to break up a peaceful protest, they managed to execute 18 people and hundreds were injured. The questions and rumours began swirling around what the new officers may be allowed to do, and there was no way the general public were going to stand for being under martial law. Robert Peel was very keen to ease the police force in, and to make sure people were policed with consent, so one thing he established was a blue uniform. This choice of colour was seen to be calm yet authoritative, not as morbid and ominous as black, not as alarming and military aligned as red. The first uniform was created with a long, dark navy blue overcoat and a top hat which was reinforced with steel to act as a helmet without being too aggressive looking. The general idea was that the police were meant to look like smart, respectable gentlemen. The decision was also made from the get-go that these officers wouldn't be armed, again to help with the confusion of the military. So guns were off the table from day one. A smart and sensible decision which has meant the UK has never had a gun problem. However, the Met weren't to be entirely defenceless. They would be armed with wooden truncheons, a small bat which they could use to defend themselves if needs be. As the recruitment of the police was rapid within London, the rest of the UK took around 30 years to catch up, the background checks on the recruits weren't that diligent. In the first year, over 2,000 officers were employed, but by the end of year one, only 600 remained, due to many being removed due to laziness, their violent leanings, or just being unsuitable for the role. Many decided to go for the role for a short while on purpose, as it paid more than a standard factory worker role, so they clocked in, got paid, and then gave up once they'd banked the extra cash, so effectively the police were busy robbing themselves at the start. This led to a lot of mistakes being made in the first few years, which threatened the success of the force. Many recruits were scrappy and difficult to control, often starting fights instead of breaking them up. This caused civil unrest and eventually protests erupted, which turned into riots when the police intervened. During 1830, several protests happened outside Parliament, which denounced the new police force. Groups gathered outside Parliament and threatened to storm it, but the new police force stood strong. However, their tactics were not delicate, and they violently attacked many protesters. On another evening, a more rowdy group of protesters began throwing stones and projectiles at Apsley House, the home of the Duke of Wellington, who you may remember from our last episode as the it boy of London at the time, and who played a part in the death of William Huskisson by steam train. If you've not yet listened or watched that one, then it's the episode before this one, so make sure you do. As the protesters shouted for the abolition of the police force with chants such as "No Peel" and "Down with the police force," the police began to get angry. As there had been very little training as to what to do with protesters, the scuffle soon turned violent, with officers raining down blows with their truncheons, knocking out many in the process, and enacting many vicious blows to people's skulls. When those that were protesting were proved right that the police force were capable of the violence they feared, they dragged away their injured friends and retreated. This, of course, was chalked up to a big success by the Met, who felt they'd done an excellent job at dispersing the crowd. But when the word got back to Robert Peel, he was mightily pissed off at what had happened. The violent tactics which had been carried out over those few days in November was far from what Peel had envisioned, and before long the police were given derogatory names which were borrowed from the first Irish police force, which had acted in much the same manner: Peelers or Bobbies. Bobbies was considered to be the more negative of the two names, and so that one seemed to stick, and it's still a nickname used today to describe the force. They also picked up other nicknames due to their proclivities for violence: the Bludgeon Men, the Truncheons, and the Blue Devils, being three which reflected their violent tactics. They were also called the Raw Lobsters. I assume this is because they were dressed in navy blue, much like the colour of a lobster before it's cooked. So with the police force causing a lot of injuries and danger to the citizens who were paying for them, instead of protecting them as required, Robert had to go back to the drawing board. With reports coming in of superintendents being drunk on duty, policemen fighting amongst themselves and accepting bribes, things were going very wrong very quickly. By 1834, Robert Peel had advanced his career and bagged the spot as Prime Minister. This gave him much more power to exact the police force he wanted, and so he issued the guidelines that all police should be following. This gave the government a way to check if the individual stations were behaving, and if they weren't, they could be reprimanded. Peel stated that first and foremost, and you'd think this one would be a given, but apparently not, the duty of policemen was to uphold the law and prevent crime. Apparently things had drifted so far from the original goal that Robert really did have to go back to basics. Amongst other guidance issued, police were meant to gain the trust and respect of the public and use them to inform about crime in their areas, so they were able to carry out their jobs more efficiently. Police were only to use force if all other techniques of persuasion and de-escalation had been used first. And in addition to them being a visible presence, a key measure of their success would be a reduction in crime. The police shouldn't be adding weight to that load, i.e. not fighting the public or being drunkards in the street who could be taken advantage of. After the kinks were ironed out in the force and the false start was pushed to one side, communities found that the regular patrols of men who weren't actually hell-bent on beating up everyone they saw in their communities did actually start to pay off. As police were nearby, and with the creation of Scotland Yard, someone seemed to be available to help quite quickly if a crime was encountered. The wilderness years in between, however, were a good time for criminals to strike, and there was a significant crime boom, particularly for petty crimes. But as soon as the police force had got themselves together, things seemed to start to calm down. That is, until the city had another population boom, and within the course of a few years, and one summer in particular, something was about to happen which would change the face of policing, and London for that matter, forever. It's the case I said I'd never do, and yet here we are. Next up in the Crime and Punishment series, I'll be covering the biggie, the crime which London is the most well known for. It's Jack the Ripper. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Macabre London. Let me know your thoughts on Spotify or my social media. And if you don't have any thoughts or theories, but you've made it this far and you just want to let me know you're a true part of the Ghoul Gang, then please leave me the lobster emoji in the comments on YouTube or Spotify and let me know what your favourite police nickname was. Now, in order to allow me to research the next episode in this series, the next episode will be a macabre mini-mystery, and then we'll be back into the thick of it once more with the Crime and Punishment series. I had an influx of new listeners recently, so a huge welcome to you if you're new, and I just want to let you know I also have another podcast called Killers, Cults and Queens, which I host with my wonderful co-host Cheryl the Queen from RuPaul's Drag Race UK. It's a look into true crime, weird happenings and strange history, so be sure to give it a go wherever you get your podcasts. In Season 3, we've covered everything from the O.J. Simpson case through to the Dyatlov Pass incident, and my favourite, the War of the Worlds hoax. So there's plenty to pick from, and we have a more casual laid-back bonus episode every week too, so that's 3 episodes a week to get your teeth stuck into. If you want to help me create this content, it's as easy as throwing a few quid my way on Patreon, in return for some pretty good extras, including early and ad-free episodes. All donations help me to keep up with my costs like newspaper archive subscriptions, books I need to buy for research, and also the odd coffee to keep me going whilst I write. So if you're able to and would like bonus content in return, including my spooky bedtime story audiobook readings, I'm currently reading War of the Worlds over there, then make sure you sign up now. A big thanks to my amazing top tier Patreon producers, Christina, Christoph, Heather's Leg, Mary, Matilda, Ravelle, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terri and Veronica, and all of our fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Macabre London. I'd love to personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang and have a natter about the latest episodes. Don't forget to check out wolfescapegames.com and use the code Macabre30 to start your adventure today. I'm so jealous you get to play it for the first time. You're gonna love it. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from the city's past. I've been Nikki Druce. Remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.